Hello, welcome to Hidden History and Odyssey Through Time. I'm your host, John Rodriguez, and welcome to Season 3 of the Best History Podcast in New York State. This is episode 27 of the podcast, and the title of this episode is Remembering a Distinguished Sailor, the Chronicle of Pearl Harbor hero Doris Miller. In September 1940, when the Selective Training and Service Act became the nation's first peacetime draft law, civil rights leaders pressured President Franklin D. Roosevelt to allow Black American men the opportunity to register and serve in integrated regiments. African Americans had participated in every conflict since the American Revolutionary War, but had done so segregated, and President Roosevelt's Secretary of War, Henry Stimson, was not interested in changing the status quo anytime soon. As World War II intensified in Europe, and with the U.S. Armed Forces in need of more men, President Roosevelt decided that Black American men could register for the draft, but they would remain segregated and the military would decide the number of blacks inducted into the armed forces. This compromise represented the conflicting experience that fell upon the 1.2 million African American men who served during World War II. They fought for democracy overseas while being treated like second-class citizens by their own country. In January 1942, the Pittsburgh Courier, once the country's most widely circulated African American newspaper, published a letter by 26-year-old James G. Thompson, a Black American serving in the military. Should I sacrifice my life to live half American? Will things be better for the next generation in the peace to follow? Would it be demanding too much to demand full citizenship rights in exchange for the sacrificing of my life? Is the kind of America I know worth defending? These and other questions need answering. I want to know, and I believe every colored American who is thinking wants to know. One young man who probably asked himself all of these questions and more, but still decided to enlist in the U.S. Navy, was a 19-year-old Black American named Doris Miller. With the promise of travel opportunities and money, which his family needed badly, Miller became a naval cook and was present at Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, when Japanese forces launched a surprise attack on the naval base there. That day, Miller became an American hero, and yet his story has been all but forgotten, buried in the sands of time, until now. Doris Miller's story, hidden history that has remained long forgotten, is the story of an unsung American hero devoted to serving his country and a nation that still viewed certain citizens as separate but equal. Doris Miller was born in Waco, Texas on October 12, 1919, the son of sharecroppers Connery and Henrietta Miller. Why the Millers decided to name their little boy Doris is unknown, but one rumor is that he was named after the midwife present at his birth. Another rumor is that the midwife who assisted his mother was convinced before his birth that the baby would be a girl, and so he was given a female name. Years later, it is said that Henrietta Miller admitted that she had hoped for a baby girl, and her wishful thinking led to the feminine name, despite her husband's protest. Despite his feminine name, Doris would later grow to be around 6 feet 3 inches tall and over 200 pounds, a solid freight train. The third of 4 sons, Doris worked to support the small family farm from an early age. In his youth, he became an excellent marksman as he hunted for small game with his brothers. Doris also had a successful school career at A.J. Moore High School. His tall stature gained the attention of the football coach at the school, who recruited Doris as the star fullback on the team. When Doris was 19, he was forced to drop out of school to support his struggling family. Although he briefly worked as a cook in a small restaurant in Waco, he was unable to find a substantial job and decided to enlist in the U.S. Navy as mess attendant 3rd class in Dallas, Texas, on September 16, 1939. This opportunity would allow Miller to travel and earn money for his family, which was ultimately his goal. At that time, black men serving in the Navy were co-signed to the lowly messman branch, where they were tasked with feeding and serving their white officers. World War II began on September 1st, 1939, when Nazi Germany invaded Poland without a formal declaration of war. In support of their mutual defense treaty obligations with Poland, France and Great Britain issued ultimatums to Hitler for the immediate withdrawal of German forces from Poland. When the ultimatum deadlines expired, Great Britain and France declared war on Germany on September 3rd, 1939. Within a month, Germany and their ally, the Soviet Union, conquered Poland and partitioned the Polish state. On April 9, 1940, Nazi forces invaded Norway and Denmark. Denmark surrendered that day. Norway held out until early June before German forces could occupy the entire country. On May 10, 1940, Nazi Germany began its assault on Western Europe by invading France and the neutral Low Countries, the Netherlands, Belgium, and Luxembourg. The Low Countries were under German occupation by the end of May. On June 22, 1940, France signed an armistice with Germany. The armistice provided for the German occupation of the northern half of France and permitted the establishment of a collaborationist regime in the south with its seat in Vichy. To pave way for an invasion of Britain, German planes bombed Britain extensively beginning in September 1940 until May 1941, known as the Blitz, including night raids on London and other industrial centers that caused heavy civilian casualties and damage. The British managed to hold off the Nazis, but with Britain's defensive resources pushed to the limit, Prime Minister Winston Churchill began receiving crucial aid from the United States under the Lend-Lease Act, passed by Congress in early 1941. The Lend-Lease Act of 1941 stated that the U.S. government could lend or lease, rather than sell, war supplies to any nation deemed vital to the defense of the United States. Although the United States was a neutral country at the time and was not actively involved in the war, President Roosevelt began sending tanks, warplanes, food, and ammunition to Great Britain. In a nationwide radio broadcast, he asserted that the best policy for keeping the United States out of the war was to become the arsenal of democracy, extending full material support to the Allies. The Lend-Lease Act of 1941 allowed the U.S. to supply military aid to its foreign allies during World War II, while still remaining officially neutral in the conflict. Following training at the Naval Training Station in Norfolk, Virginia, which was racially segregated at the time, Miller was assigned to the ammunition ship USS Pyro, where he served as a mess attendant in November 1939. 2 months later, on January 2, 1940, Miller was transferred to USS West Virginia, where he became the ship's heavyweight boxing champion. In June and July 1940, Miller had temporary duty aboard USS Nevada at Secondary Battery Gunnery School. He returned to USS West Virginia on August 3, 1940, and remained on that ship for the remainder of 1940 and into 1941. On February 16, 1941, Miller was promoted to Mess Attendant Second Class. As the year 1941 progressed, the USS West Virginia carried out a schedule of intensive training, using the naval facilities at Pearl Harbor as a base and operating in various task forces and groups in the Hawaiian operating area. Pearl Harbor, Hawaii is located near the center of the Pacific Ocean, roughly 2,000 miles from the U.S. mainland and about 4,000 miles from Japan. This routine by the battleships continued even through the unusually tense period that began in late November 1941 and extended into the next month between the United States and Japan. After being out at sea for so long during these training operations, it was necessary for the ships to then return to port for maintenance. This meant that the USS West Virginia and the other battleships would be moored or anchored along the southeast shores of Ford Island in the center of Pearl Harbor. This is how 22-year-old mess attendant second class Doris Miller found himself at Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. On the morning of December 7th, 1941, USS West Virginia and the rest of the U.S. fleet were moored at Battleship Row in Pearl Harbor, with Doris Miller aboard West Virginia. Miller got out of bed at 6 a.m. and was collecting soiled laundry when the alarm for general quarters sounded around 8 a.m. It was at that time that Japanese planes filled the sky over Pearl Harbor. Then bombs and bullets rained down onto the U.S. vessels moored below. At 8:10 a.m., a 1,800-pound bomb smashed through the deck of the battleship USS Arizona and landed in her forward ammunition magazine. The ship exploded and sank, with more than 1,000 men trapped inside. Turns out the Empire of Japan was launching a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor. Making his way to his battle station, situated towards the middle of the ship, Miller discovered that torpedo damage had wrecked it, so he went up on deck. Because of his physical strength, Miller was assigned to carry wounded fellow sailors to places of greater safety. Then an officer ordered him to the bridge to aid the mortally wounded captain of the ship. Once he had helped those he could, Miller then seized control of a .50 caliber Browning anti-aircraft machine gun and let it rip, bullets whizzing through the air at the attacking Japanese planes. It's worth noting that Miller had not been trained to operate such a weapon because black sailors serving in the segregated stewards branch of the Navy were not given the gunnery training received by white sailors. As soon as the machine gun ran out of ammunition, Miller and the other survivors were then ordered to abandon the sinking ship. Miller was one of the last 3 men to leave West Virginia. He and his shipmates swam 300 or 400 yards to shore, avoiding patches of flaming oil from the battleship Arizona and machine gun fire from Japanese planes. Miller later told his brother that, with those bullets splattering all around me, it was by the grace of God that I never got a scratch. Although news stories have credited Doris Miller with downing from 2 to 5 airplanes, quoting Miller himself in some cases, these accounts have never been verified. Miller himself later told Navy officials he thought he hit one of the planes during the battle. It wasn't hard. I just pulled the trigger and she worked fine. I had watched the others with these guns. I guess I fired her for about 15 minutes. I think I got one of those Jap planes. They were diving pretty close to us. Miller also stated that when the Japanese bombers attacked my ship at Pearl Harbor, I forgot all about the fact that I and other Negroes can be only messmen in the Navy and are not taught how to man an anti-aircraft gun. During the attack on Pearl Harbor, Japanese aircraft dropped 2 armored piercing bombs through the deck of Miller's battleship and launched 5 18-inch aircraft torpedoes into her port side. Heavily damaged by the ensuing explosions and suffering from severe flooding below decks, the crew abandoned ship while the USS West Virginia slowly settled to the harbor bottom. Of the 1,541 men on West Virginia during the attack, 130 were killed and 52 wounded. The battleship was later refloated, repaired, and modernized, serving in the Pacific Theater for the rest of World War II. In the 2-hour attack on Pearl Harbor, Japanese warplanes sank or damaged 18 warships and destroyed 164 aircraft. Over 2,400 servicemen and civilians lost their lives. The United States could no longer remain isolated from World War II. On December 8, 1941, President Franklin D. Roosevelt spoke before a joint session of Congress.
Mr. Vice President, Mr. Speaker, members of the Senate and of the House of Representatives, Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy, the United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. The United States was at peace with that nation, and at the solicitation of Japan was still in conversation with its government and its emperor, looking toward the maintenance of peace in the Pacific. The attack yesterday on the Hawaiian Islands has caused severe damage to American naval and military forces. I regret to tell you that very many American lives have been lost. In addition, American ships have been reported torpedoed on the high seas between San Francisco and Honolulu. As Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy, I have directed that all measures be taken for our defense, but always will our whole nation remember the character of the onslaught against us.
President Roosevelt went on to ask Congress to declare war against Japan, a declaration that was granted with just one dissenting vote. 3 days later, December 11th, Germany and Italy, allied with Japan, declared war on the United States. Later that same day, the United States formally declared that a state of war existed with Germany and Italy. The United States was now drawn into a global war. On December 13, 1941, Doris Miller reported to USS Indianapolis. On New Year's Day, 1942, the Navy released its list of commendations for heroism at Pearl Harbor. On the list was a single commendation for an unnamed black sailor. When Miller's mother heard the news of the black sailor who manned the machine gun, she was confident it was her son. "That's gotta be Doris they talking about," she later told Texas historian R. Chris Santos. It wasn't until March 1942 that the Pittsburgh Courier, an influential African-American newspaper based in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, released a story that at last identified the black messman as Doris Miller. On April 1st, 1942, Miller was commended by the Secretary of the Navy, Frank Knox, and on May 27, 1942, he became the first African-American recipient of the Navy Cross, the second highest military decoration awarded for sailors and Marines who distinguished themselves for extraordinary heroism in combat with an armed enemy force. The medal was personally presented to Miller by Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, the Commander-in-Chief, Pacific Fleet, on board aircraft carrier USS Enterprise, stationed at Pearl Harbor at the time. Speaking of Miller, Admiral Nimitz had the following to say: "This marks the first time in this conflict that such high tribute has been made in the Pacific Fleet to a member of his race, and I'm sure that the future will see others similarly honored for brave acts." Doris Miller, the black son of Texas sharecroppers and grandson of slaves, had finally made a name for himself. A month after Doris Miller received the Navy Cross, the Pittsburgh Courier called for Miller to be returned to the States for a war bond tour. The paper demanded that Secretary Knox order him home so that he may perform the same service among his people that the white heroes are performing among their people. Wendell Willkie, the 1940 Republican nominee for president, and New York's popular mayor, Fiorello LaGuardia, also urged the Navy Secretary to allow Miller to return on a war bond tour. Doris Miller himself was eager to make the trip. As he wrote to the Courier on September 26, "I do hope your paper will continue to campaign in my behalf. It would be a great pleasure to get back for only a few days." On June 1st, 1942, Doris Miller was promoted to mess attendant first class, and by November 1942, the campaign to get Miller home for a war bond tour was successful, and he returned to the west coast of the United States. Over the course of the next 2+ months, Miller gave talks in Oakland, California, in his hometown of Waco, Texas, and in Dallas and Chicago, promoting war bond sales and accepting tokens of admiration from black communities. Perhaps most significantly, on January 28, 1943, Miller addressed the first class of black sailors to graduate from Camp Robert Smalls. "It is almost unbelievable just what the perfect coordination and strength of our Navy actually is," Miller told a reporter, and he urged the new sailors to take advantage of their opportunities. It was during this brief return to the U.S. that Doris Miller would see his home and family for the last time. On June 1st, 1943, Miller received his last promotion to cook third class. In August 1943, he was a member of the commissioning crew of the newly constructed USS Liscome Bay and was then assigned to that escort carrier. From November 20th to the 23rd, 1943, Miller was on board the Liscome Bay during Operation Galvanic, the seizure of Macon and Tarawa atolls in the Gilbert Islands. The escort carrier's aircraft supported the marine operations ashore, pounding Japanese gun emplacements and air bases. With Thanksgiving approaching, Miller had wrote a letter to his mother saying that he did not expect the war to end soon, but asked that she prepare a place at the table for me in 1945. "I will eat dinner with you all with a smile. Tell my friends to live the life that I am living." Sadly, Doris Miller would not live to see 1945. At 5:10 a.m. on November 24th, 1943, the USS Liscome Bay was part of a task group steaming 20 miles southwest of Butaratari Island in the Pacific Ocean at 15 knots, when a lookout shouted that a torpedo was in the water heading towards the ship. Within moments, the deadly underwater ordnance, one of several torpedoes fired from the Japanese submarine I-175, slammed into the escort carrier's starboard side. The torpedo hit at the worst possible location, near the bomb magazine. The resulting massive explosions triggered when the bombs ignited killed many crewmen instantly, including some pilots sitting in the cockpits of their aircraft on deck, awaiting the first launch of the day. Those more fortunate souls remembered the tremendous shock of the blow that threw them to the deck and into bulkheads. In many spaces, steam lines ruptured and the power went out. In some cases, badly burned, and in others suffering from broken bones and shrapnel wounds, the survivors made their way through shattered hatches, twisted bulkheads, and in any hole they could find, in an effort to reach topside so that they could abandon ship. Only 272 officers and enlisted men survived the sinking of Liscome Bay, from the crew of more than 900. Cook third class Doris Miller, age 24, was listed as missing, presumed dead. In a telegram dated December 6, 1943, Doris Miller's parents were informed that he was missing by Rear Admiral Randall Jacobs, Chief of Naval Personnel. In January 1944, less than 2 months after Miller went missing, the Navy opened a modest officer training program at Camp Robert Smalls for black sailors, commissioning its first 13 black officers on March 17, 1944. Family and friends held a memorial service for Doris Miller on April 30th, 1944, at the Second Baptist Church in Waco, Texas, sponsored by the Victory Club. On May 28th, a granite marker was dedicated at Moore High School to honor Doris Miller. On November 25th, 1944, a year and 1 day after the sinking of the USS Liscome Bay, Doris Miller was presumed dead by the Secretary of the Navy. His body was never recovered. In addition to the Navy Cross, Doris Miller received the following awards after his death: the Purple Heart Medal, the American Defense Service Medal with Fleet Clasp, the Asiatic Pacific Campaign Medal with 1 star, and the World War II Victory Medal. The one award Doris Miller should have received but didn't was the Medal of Honor, and while he was still alive, bills were quickly introduced in the U.S. House of Representatives and Senate to award Miller the Medal of Honor. However, Georgia Democrat Carl Vinson, the House of Representatives Chairman of Naval Affairs, claimed that Miller's deeds were not deserving of the nation's highest award for valor. Secretary of the Navy William Franklin Knox and the congressional delegation from Miller's home state seconded him. And so Doris Miller never received the Medal of Honor, even to this day. Indeed, not a single black sailor, soldier, or Marine was awarded the Medal of Honor between 1941 and 1945, and in 1996, Vernon J. Baker was the only black veteran of World War II to be awarded this decoration while still alive. The unconditional surrender of Nazi Germany was signed in the early morning hours of Monday, May 7, 1945, at Supreme Headquarters, Allied Expeditionary Force at Reims in northeastern France. On May 8, 1945, President Harry S. Truman formally announced the unconditional surrender of Nazi Germany to the American people from the White House.
This is a solemn but a glorious hour. I only wish that Franklin D. Roosevelt had lived to witness this day. General Eisenhower informs me that the forces of Germany have surrendered to the United Nations. The flags of freedom fly all over Europe. Our rejoicing is sobered and subdued by a supreme consciousness of the terrible price we have paid to rid the world of Hitler and his evil band. We can repay the debt which we owe to our God, to our dead, and to our children only by work, by ceaseless devotion to the responsibilities which lie ahead of us. If I could give you a single watchword for the coming months, that word is work, work, and more work. We must work to finish the war. Our victory is but half won. The West is free, but the East is still in bondage to the treacherous tyranny of the Japanese. When the last Japanese division has surrendered unconditionally, then only will our fighting job be done.
Nazi Germany may have been defeated, but the Japanese Empire was still a major threat that had to be dealt with. The thought of invading Japan gave Truman and his advisors pause. The war has shown that the Japanese were fighting for the emperor, who convinced them that it was better to die than surrender. Women and children had been taught how to kill with basic weapons. Japanese kamikaze pilots could turn planes into guided missiles. The cost of invasion, they knew, would be high. After a successful test of a new, very powerful bomb in July 1945, President Truman issued the Potsdam Declaration demanding the unconditional surrender of the Japanese government, warning of prompt and utter destruction. 11 days later, on August 6, 1945, having received no reply from Japan, the United States detonated an atomic bomb over the Japanese city of Hiroshima. 3 days later, another atomic bomb was detonated over the Japanese city of Nagasaki. Between the two cities, the result was approximately 120,000 people killed, with thousands later dying of radiation sickness and thousands more injured. Both cities were leveled from the bombs, and this was enough to force Japan to surrender. On August 14, 1945, President Harry S. Truman announced the unconditional surrender of Japan to reporters gathered at the White House.
I have received this afternoon a message from the Japanese government in reply to the message forwarded to that government by the Secretary of State on August 11th. I deem this reply a full acceptance of the Potsdam Declaration which specifies the unconditional surrender of Japan. In the reply, there is no qualification. Arrangements are now being made for the formal signing of the surrender terms at the earliest possible moment. General Douglas MacArthur has been appointed the Supreme Allied Commander to receive the Japanese surrender. Great Britain, Russia, and China will be represented by high-ranking officers. Meantime, the Allied armed forces have been ordered to suspend offensive action. The proclamation of VJ Day must await upon the formal signing of the surrender terms by Japan.
The following day, Japan's Emperor Hirohito broadcast the surrender to the Japanese people on Radio Tokyo, and on September 2nd, 1945, aboard the new 45,000-ton battleship USS Missouri, and before representatives of 9 Allied nations, the Japanese signed their surrender, bringing World War II to a close. In May 1949, Doris Miller's father, Connery, died before he had a chance to see the commissioning of the USS Miller, a Knox-class frigate named in honor of Doris Miller, on June 30th, 1973. Miller's mother, Henrietta, was a sponsor for the ship and was present for the ceremony at Norfolk Naval Shipyard in Portsmouth, Virginia, with her youngest son, Arthur. At some point during the ceremony, Mrs. Miller was presented with a painting of her son, Doris, by the crew of the vessel. On June 6, 1982, Doris Miller's mother, Henrietta, died at the age of 87, years after burying a husband and 2 sons. In 2001, actor Cuba Gooding Jr. portrayed Doris Miller in the Hollywood film Pearl Harbor. On February 4, 2010, Doris Miller was honored by the United States Postal Service as one of 4 distinguished sailors with the release of a 44-cent commemorative stamp. In January 2019, Huntington Ingalls Industries Newport News Shipbuilding was awarded a contract by the U.S. Navy for 2 aircraft carriers, CVN-80 and CVN-81, the first of its kind since the 1980s. In 2020, it was announced by the Navy that one of the new aircraft carriers, CVN-81, would be named after Doris Miller. This will be the second U.S. warship named after Cook 3rd Class Doris Miller, U.S. Navy, who was killed in action in November 1943. On August 25, 2021, with 6 members of Doris Miller's family in attendance, the Navy conducted the first cut of steel ceremony at Newport News Shipbuilding, signaling the formal start of construction for the 4th Ford-class aircraft carrier. The USS Doris Miller, CVN-81, is scheduled to be laid down January 2026, launched October 2029, and commissioned in 2032. In closing, we here at Hidden History would like to say that Doris Miller's death was not in vain. The memory of his life, which we have covered here today, can burn brightly as an example of how an underprivileged and oppressed young man from rural Texas rose above poverty and racial discrimination, not only to display great courage, devotion, and patriotism, but to help alter the course of American history. For all the young men listening, let Doris Miller be your role model, not some foolish basketball player or played out mainstream rapper. Thank you for listening, and I hope that you've learned something new today. Season 3 of Hidden History will explore the lives of veterans of the United States as well as veterans of foreign countries historically connected to our nation, such as Britain, France, and Spain. Many of their stories have been hidden in the pages of history and deserve to be told. Pictures, newspaper clippings, and links to external articles relating to a particular episode are available on our website, hiddenhistorypod.com. Because our next episode is scheduled to come out after Christmas, we here at Hidden History would like to take a moment to wish you all a very Merry Christmas. And yes, we here at Hidden History say Merry Christmas, not Happy Holidays. Thanks again for listening. I'm John Rodriguez, and until we meet again, This has been Hidden History and Odyssey Through Time.